So excited to be here. You know, first of all, I am so happy to see so many people knitting in one room. So great. I always say that when my novel, The Knitting Circle, came out, and I would go to bookstores and knitting stores to talk about it and read from it, when I would go to bookstores, the knitters would sit in the back, and they would hide their knitting in a bag, and like take it out once I started. And I would say, no, it's okay, you don't have to do it secretly. The knitting stores, they didn't even look up when I came in. If they dropped a stitch or had a question, they would just talk right over me. And I just said, that's so much better, you know, because they're knitting. It's so great. So I thought I would talk to you a little about how this anthology came to be. It's such a labor of love for me, and I'm so excited. And I'm going to read a very small section from my essay in it, and then turn it over to Elissa, who will, I don't know, read from her essay, I suppose. And then we're going to sit down and talk a little bit. So I came to knitting late in life. I learned in 2002. And actually, if anyone had told me I would be standing at a podium having edited an anthology of writers writing about knitting, and that I would be delighted to see so many people knitting, I would not have believed them. Because I have never been very crafty. In fact, the only class that I did not get an A in practically my entire life was sewing, home economics, 9th grade. And all we had to do was make a wraparound skirt, Simplicity Pattern 101. And I could not do it. That whole class, that sewing machine, that skirt became my nemesis. I remember they took us to this fabric store, and although I think on some level I understood that our clothes came from fabric, confronted with all that fabric, I was really kind of gobsmacked. I was like, and the teacher says, choose one, hurry up. And so I picked the biggest paisley print, which you do not want on your rear end, like ever. Maybe that's why I hated the skirt so much. There was something called a bobbin that I really couldn't figure out. I couldn't pin the pattern to the fabric. The sewing machine would go backwards suddenly and seemingly of its own accord, and the thread would break off. And my home economics teacher used to shave her eyebrows off and then draw them in in red, so she always looked totally surprised. And she would be walking around, you know, and she would loom over me, counting down how many weeks before this had to be finished, you know, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, and then finally I just took it home and had my cousin make it. She knew how to sew, and I got caught and in big trouble, and well, that's a whole other anthology, sewing nightmares. So I was not eager to learn how to knit, but in 2002, after our daughter died suddenly when she was 5, I learned about the transformative and healing powers of knitting. Wonderful friends, when they learned that I had suddenly lost my ability to form sentences, to write or to read, they came up with the wonderful idea that I should do something with my hands, and that thing was knitting. I went home promptly. This is 2002, so I looked in the yellow pages. If you don't know what those are, I can talk to you about it later. And I called every knitting store, and I had missed every beginner's class. It was October, they had all started in September, and I remember this feeling of, I am trying so desperately to pull myself out of this grief, and I can't even take a knitting class, something I don't even really want to do. And then one day I was picking my son up from school, and a woman I didn't know very well who worked at the school knocked on my window, the car window, and handed me a piece of paper. And she said, this woman is going to teach you to knit. I found out years later that the woman who handed me that piece of paper had a son with cystic fibrosis. And she had learned how to knit because she waited so much in waiting rooms, hospital rooms, doctor's offices, and she said it's what saved her sanity. And so she was someone who knew. Well, my teacher, who I dedicated this book to, told me I was maybe one of the worst people she's ever had to teach to knit. I didn't even know that knitting was moving stitches from one needle to another. I had no idea what it was or how to do it. But I did know that first day when I sat for 2.5 hours and left with 4 rows, that this was something that I was going to do for the rest of my life. And in fact, that's been true. So then I became a knitter, and I would be at writers' conferences, or just bookstore readings, or all sorts of places, and I would bring my knitting. And I learned pretty quickly that I listen better when I knit. It's really weird. It looks like you're not paying attention, but I hear a lot more of readings and talks, lectures, the whole thing, when I'm sitting there knitting. And I always go to the back row so I don't distract the reader. And you look to your left and you look to your right, and who's in the back row with you? The other knitters. And so I find myself saying to Anita Shreve or Samantha Lan Chang or Eleanor Lipman, what are you knitting? Do you know the good knitting store in this town? And then often, how long have you been knitting? And I began to hear stories, wonderful stories, funny stories. I have to tell you that not every story in this book, essay in this book, is about the delights of knitting. It's often about how frustrated knitting makes them, or how they cannot learn to knit, or just a memory of someone they loved knitting. So it isn't always about the person themselves being the knitter. But as I heard these stories, I was like, the world has to hear about these, So when I was at that lunch with my editor, where she sort of asks, well, what are you thinking about doing next? I start talking about an anthology where writers write about knitting. Now, my editor is wonderful. She did edit the Knitting Circle, but she is not a knitter. And her eyes were kind of glazing over, I would say. But she didn't say no, so I took that as a yes. And I began to ask people if they would contribute essays, and then the question, do you know another writer who knits? And pretty soon I had this amazing list of writers, of course including Elissa, and the people I've already mentioned, but Jane Smiley, Sue Grafton, Elizabeth Berg, so many wonderful writers. They're listed on the back. You'll see how great it is. And in January, when I went to press, I was teaching in Florida, and Ann Patchett was there. And I was knitting, and she said, oh, I'll come sit and knit with you. I'll go get my sweater. And I said, oh, you knit? I wish I had known. I would have asked you up to this anthology. She said, no, I want to be in it. And I said, oh, no, it's already gone to press. And she said, no, but I want to be in it. And I was thinking, I don't know if my editor is going to hate me more for saying no to Ann Patchett or for calling her and saying stop the presses. And I was trying to decide. And then she said, I'll get you Barbara Kingsolver. And I said, you can be in it. So it had been 25 writers writing about knitting, which is a nice number that you give things, 10, 20, 25, 27. But these amazing writers who were super busy, and had a lot to do, we stopped the presses and they had 2 weeks to write their essays. But they did it because they loved knitting so much. And they wrote incredible essays. And so that's why it's 27, this funny number. And we'll talk a lot more about knitting and all things knitting, but I'd like to give the history of how the book even came to be, because for me, it was a lot of happy days of these essays coming into my inbox. And writers I know, or friends, and writers I love, and writers I just admire but don't know, were sharing this intimate part of their lives with me, and now with all of you. So I wrote, my essay is called 10 Things I Learned from Knitting, and I'm just going to read you a short one. It's number 3, and it's some days it's okay to just knit dish rags. One of my favorite things to knit is dish rags. Although I have a complicated basket weave pattern, and although those dish rags look really, really beautiful, I prefer to knit simpler ones. I know the pattern by heart. Cast on 4 stitches. Knit those 4 stitches. Then knit 2, yarn over, knit to the end of the row until there are 44 stitches. At that point, you knit 2 together, yarn over again, knit 2 more together, and knit to the end of the row, and you're back to 4 stitches. At that point, you have a dish rag. The yarn these require is cotton and sells for about $2 a skein. You get a couple of dish rags from that one skein. I knit them so often that now I even make patterns, using up all my leftover bits to form stripes or zigzags or whatever. They are, after all, just dish rags. It's hard to make an ugly one. I like to knit dish rags for hostesses, even though when I present them at dinner parties, I'm often met with a really confused look. It's a dish rag, I explain. I knit it for you. Thank you is a common response. Once, this woman didn't know what to do with this, so she said, oh, okay, and she wrapped it around the wine bottle. I don't know what that is. She thought it was a wine cozy, which is nice. I also like to knit them as thank you gifts or to give to people I really like. Some people even love my dish rags. My friend Kimberly asks for more of them. My friend Matthew held it to his face to soothe his aching jaw after he had his wisdom teeth out. I have friends who can't bear to use them as dish rags. Too special, they say. Too pretty. And I will tell an aside from this because Elissa's here. At Tin House once, I was teaching with Amy Bender, and did you notice how I just stuttered? I'm like such a fan of hers, like I'm such a groupie. And then I realized we were sharing a bathroom, and I was like so excited. I was like, should I teach Amy Bender? You know, this is so cool. So I quickly knit her a dish rag. And she was in there like blow drying her hair or whatever, you know, and I said, here, and she's like, I'm in the bathroom. You know, this is kind of weird. And, oh, okay, she doesn't know where to put it because we're in a bathroom, you know, so she kind of puts it down. And it's a dish rack. She's like, okay, but I think she thinks now that I maybe am the weirdest person she has ever met. And she may be correct. My favorite things I knit, though, are white dish rags that my cousin Gloria Jean and I tie-dyed. Years ago, when we were 13 years old, we saw John Sebastian of the Love and Spoonful perform solo at Brown University's spring weekend. We fell in love that night with the song Darling Be Home Soon, with any guy who plays the guitar, and with tie-dye, which John Sebastian was decked out in from head to toe. That summer, we tie-dyed everything. We played Darling Be Home Soon and dreamed about boys and poetry as we tie-dyed in my hot backyard. This past April, I had the opportunity to have dinner with John Sebastian. As soon as I learned about that dinner, I set to work knitting 2 white dish rags. Then my cousin Gloria Jean came over and we tie-dyed them and brought them to the dinner. The tie-dyeing was not so great. It had been 40 years since we'd last done it. But I didn't care. John Sebastian now owns my dish rags. And I have to say, when he opened them and he looked at it, he said, don't quit your day job. You see, I'm an overachiever. As a kid, I fretted over grades. Even an A- was enough to send me into a fit of anxiety. I need to make perfect dinners. I need to write beautiful sentences. I wear foundation and blush even if I'm just going to the grocery store. I need to be good, to impress, to do better than last time and then better still. But when I knit dish rags, all that goes away. Sometimes it's enough to just cast on 4 stitches, use cheap cotton yarn, and knit a really simple thing for someone.
I own one of those dish rags, and I have to say they're absolutely lovely. I can't imagine putting that. I thought that you were joking when you said it was a dish rag. Because it's so beautiful. You would never put it in soapy water, or not in my soapy water. It's a real gift, as is being in this book and getting to be Anne's friend. As you might imagine, Anne could have had anyone in the world, I think, contribute to this book. I can't believe you don't have 2,700 people. So Anne finds knitting really restorative and healing. I have tried very hard to find knitting restorative and healing. And I'll show you one of my projects. Well, not a project, it's finished. It's absolutely done. It's perfect. But my title is called High Strung Knitter. I'll try not to pick my cuticles while I read. I will admit, yes, I can be a little high strung. Even so, I was surprised when, during a routine physical 6 years ago, my doctor announced that I had high blood pressure. It wasn't possible. Me, I was young, I was healthy, okay. Healthy-ish, not overweight. Okay, tense, perhaps I was a little tense, which isn't a bad thing, right? If you're not tense, you're not paying attention. I mean, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. At the time, W was deploying troops like a kid playing with army men. I was in the middle of writing a book, in addition to my monthly book column and teaching, and picking up work wherever I could. I had children, 2 children who had become addicted to food and shelter, and cool enough not to be duped into believing people wore tinfoil shoes. And I had insomnia, and maybe I was grinding my teeth. The headaches weren't new, so okay, maybe yes, my blood pressure was up. I suppose if you wanted to get technical about it, and doctors are all about the technical, this wasn't good. You need to bring your pressure down, my doctor advised me. If you can't bring it down, then I will have to put you on statins. Statins? Statins didn't sound like a good drug. It didn't possess the ring of a good drug like Wellbutrin, which promised to make you well, or Effexor, which sounded like the name of a superhero. Statins suggested static and statistics, the word itself like the prick of a pin, the opposite of the dreamy sounding Valium, which was so close to helium. Do you exercise? What about yoga? Oh, sure, I say, I've done yoga, which was true. Where I was misleading was in my tone, which suggested an openness to going back to yoga, which I could do, but given recent history, it wouldn't help. Yoga made me tense. The girls who challenge each other to see who could hop across the mat fastest with a leg tucked behind their head. The last time I'd gone, the instructor, clearly exasperated that my downward dog pose suggested a puppy with distemper, had whacked me on the back of the head and told me, relax. That's totally true. I've never heard of anyone doing that. Have you ever tried knitted? My doctor said it's a great way to relieve stress. A lot of people find it very therapeutic. Growing up, my sister and I were not allowed to watch television unless we were doing something with our hands, drawing, beading, embroidering, making pot holders. We had pot holders enough for an octopus's soup kitchen, and for a short time I had tried knitting. Both of my grandmothers and my mother knit. My grandmothers knitted us hats with pom-poms and fancy cabled sweaters with intricately designed yokes, patterned with snowflakes, leaves, and flowers. The tag in the back reading always, made with love by Grandma. My mom knit too, although not with the same zeal. Her sweaters had dolman sleeves or were made out of eclectic yarns, some spun with feathers. The first thing I made, the only thing I recall making, was a rainbow-colored rug for my dollhouse. Okay, it started out in my mind as a sweater, downgraded to a scarf once I began to drop stitches and add them. My knitting expanding and narrowing, the middle swollen like the anaconda digesting a cow. Until the physical evidence of my incompetence was undeniable, I begged my mother to teach me to cast off. The rug looked like a place in the dollhouse which my father had built for us. The rug looked out of place in the dollhouse which my father had built us. It was spare and modern and furnished in blonde Scandinavian-style furniture that looked like it came from the Barbie IKEA. In contrast, the rug looked like something pulled out of a dumpster. Still, surely I could knit again. After all, wasn't it in my blood? Soon after, in the way that shoplifters start noticing other people sticking turkeys under their sweatshirts, I started seeing knitters everywhere, a sisterhood of flashing needles. Like all of you.